Academy's presentation. Some of you spent most of the day here at the Commons. Today was the dedication of the Amanda Bridge, a 2-year project, collaborative effort with federal, state, tribal, city, volunteer groups. It was absolutely fabulous. There were probably close to 90 people that were ferried to the driveway and then hiked down to the bridge. Beautiful dedication. The weather held, even right at the end the sun came out and shone right through the weeds right where we were. Then we came back here for a beautiful potluck. More food than the 100 people could possibly eat, but they managed. The Native Americans did a drumming and singing, and then our local Bad Weeds group entertained us for a while. So it was quite an afternoon. It took us 2 years to do that bridge project, which is record time when you're dealing with feds, state, bureaucracies, et cetera, et cetera. So
only took 2 days to assemble.
2 days to build the bridge, fiberglass, full span across the creek. It'll last longer than any of us and for several other generations. But more important was the new connection between the tribes and YAAS and its area residents. That was the most significant thing about the whole project. We needed the bridge to cross and keep the trail open. But beyond that, there was much more importance to the help that everybody gave to build that bridge. Some of you may have our list of events that was the last half of this year. There's been one change, and that's for next month. November 26th is the actual date of the 2nd anniversary of the Academy. But we had a chance to bring the Monmouth Taiko drummers back on Saturday, December 10th. They were here last year. It was a fabulous performance, and decided that would be a worthy 2nd anniversary. So that'll be Saturday, December 10th, 6:30. They will be doing a workshop in the afternoon about 1:30. They are limiting it to 20 people. Between the YAAS drummers group and the Newport drummers group, I think we have about 40 interested in signing up for it, so I don't know how we'll deal with that. But if you've never heard Japanese taiko traditional drumming, when they hit the big drum, it feels like it's coming right from the center of your heart. It's unbelievable. So that'll be an exciting way to celebrate, and we'll have food and merriment and everything else to celebrate that occasion. And then on December 21st, we'll do our 2nd annual Solstice Bonfire. I acquired all the pallets from the Ladies Club for their new chairs and tables, and they're drying out nicely. They're all kiln dried, so it'll be a good bonfire. I've known the Clintons for probably 2 decades. They were neighbors when we had the New Morning Coffee House and regular patrons. Spent many hours talking with them. And then they moved closer to my nursery, and I'd meet him at the Green Salmon. We'd have more good conversation. So I didn't know he was a doctor. He never said anything about that. I knew he was at OSU. And in the past, we've had several of the Chautauqua events here in the Commons. The Friends of the Commons presented them. They were absolutely fabulous events. Oregon Humanities changed that format and is now doing the Conversation Project. And their catalog just lists dozens and dozens of professors and experts in various areas, and they come to do a program. It's a little different than Chautauqua. It's not just a presentation. It's involving the audience and conversation, not just question and answer, but more of a conversation project. So we're very happy to have Dr. Richard Clinton with us, and his topic of why we cannot make necessary changes that we see obvious need to happen. So I'm going to turn the rest of the program over to Dr. Clinton and enjoy it.
Thank you, Don, and thank you all for coming out. And I'm tremendously honored to be here on the day of the dedication of the Amanda Trail Bridge. That was an extremely moving ceremony, and I'm glad I got to see it and to be a part of the day here. As Don said, I'm an old Haitian here from 32 years back, but only on the weekends, unfortunately, since I still have some obligations there at OSU. Whoa, great. I don't want to use as much. I'll get out in front.
Help those.
Okay. Well, the title that I see displayed here is really going to disappoint you. Why? I'm not going to tell you why, or I don't think we'll even arrive at a good reason why we don't pay attention to these warnings. The title of the talk, or the conversation, as I hope it will be, is 200 Years of Unheeded Warnings. We're slow learners, 200 years of unheeded warnings. So I'm not telling you why we didn't follow these warnings, but I think it's really helpful for us to review these warnings and just realize that they've been out there for so long. And then we need to ask ourselves why we haven't really paid attention, why we haven't listened to reason. We're supposed to be reasonable, rational animals. And yet the warnings have been there very clearly for 2 whole centuries at least, and we're in bigger trouble today than we have been in those 2 centuries. So somehow or other we're not paying attention. You want to move back to some? There's the title. And there's the first of the warnings. In 1798, Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus said this, wrote an essay that said this: the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. Population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. So, as opposed to the geometric ratio would be 2, 4, 6, 8 by multiplication, in other words, whereas arithmetic is 1, 2, 3, 4. So by the time you've done 1, 2, 3, 4, you've done 2, 4, 6, 8 on the geometrical progression, and obviously you're going to get out of whack pretty quickly. And while he came away with a lot of egg on his face, in a way, historically speaking, because he said this in 1798, just as the New World was really opening up with all of the new agricultural lands that entailed, and of course just as the Industrial Revolution was about to get underway, and the cross-fertilization between industry and agriculture with tractors and fossil fuels increasing the production of agriculture so much, it made him look basically wrong for a long time. But I think he was basically right. What do you think? Here's the conversation beginning.
Well, technologically, we were able to push, the production of food much higher through technology, but that really doesn't disprove what it was, what he said there. That it's really through technology that we have been able to sort of put this off.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. Jerome?
Well, if you look at the next stage in terms of mathematics, 1, 2, 3, 4 doesn't sound bad to 2, 4, 6, 8, but then you go 5, 64, and
that's right. It's the J curve of population we've seen. Yes, John?
Well, the Chinese are obviously worried.
They certainly are.
Required for each family only to have 1 child.
Right.
I guess now they've gone so far that they have to go back that way.
Well, it was a pretty draconian policy that they announced to have only 1 child per family in a country that had always had many. And it never was really enforced that much in the countryside. It just couldn't be. But in the cities, it's been enforced very strongly, and it's made them very unpopular anyway.
Yeah, I think it's even worse than you said. The geometric progression is 2, 4, 8, 16.
Oh, that's right. That's what Jerome was saying. Yeah, it was very, very fast after that. So it's understandable, perhaps, that we didn't pay that much attention to this one, given these other factors that we've just talked about. But we are reaching a stage now where I think we need to look at it again and see how much more technology and scientific advances can really do to increase our food supply if population does continue to grow geometrically, as it has continued, of course, in the less developed part of the world. Let's look at the next one here. This one always amazed me, but of course it's the poets who have the greatest foresight. Ezra Pound once said that poets are the antennae of the race. They are like the antennae on an ant. Feels what is ahead. And certainly Wordsworth had it pretty well nailed in 1807 when he said, "The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon." What do you think of that? How contemporary could anything be? And especially in terms of our scientific, technological, industrial emphasis in modern society, where the emotions, the feelings, the heart have all been put aside compared to the reason, the rational factor.
The media tells us to buy it.
Excuse me?
The media tells us to buy it.
Yes.
Get and spend.
Getting and spending is what we're increasingly all about. As President Bush told us after 9/11. Go out and keep spending that. It's pretty clear where that leads in the long run. It leads to a very materialistic, self-centered form of life that doesn't look out for each other, for community, for the kind of values that I think we see here in YAAS to an extraordinary degree, where there is community. But that's not what you see in a lot of the cities of our nation. So this is an interesting thing that I couldn't help but throw in. And it's apropos because we had a quotation from a poem from Shelley at the ceremony today. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was the wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley. And in 1818, they were playing parlor games kind of in Switzerland with Lord Byron, and were making up ghost stories and things to entertain each other. And she came up with this idea that became Dr. Frankenstein. And Frankenstein was not the monster that we think of as Frankenstein, the monster, but he was the scientist who created the monster. And in creating that monster, I think she really had a presentment that was amazingly prescient about modern society altogether, getting out of our control and turning on us, as the monster itself did in her story. So Frankenstein, this is from a preface to the book in another edition, recent edition. Frankenstein, or A Modern Prometheus, as the actual title is, described by Marilyn Butler, the editor of Oxford University Press's 1994 version, as a mocking expose of leaders and achievers who leave desolation in their wake, showing humanity its choice to live cooperatively or to die of selfishness. And I think, in a sense, that monster is an allegory of the treacherous potential of modern science to turn on its creators. Any of you actually read Frankenstein? Or, yeah.
I
Did
think
you
the
have that
last
feeling?
one is what the popular media and the movies and so forth, and the population believes. But if you read the book, that isn't really it.
No, not at all.
It's not at all about science. It's about the man himself who doesn't think about the impact of what he's doing. He just goes and does it. And every time this creature, who was actually quite well-read and spoke very well,
Right.
when he ran amok, Dr. Frankenstein beat himself on the chest, got brain fever, and went into a coma for 3 months, and so he didn't have any responsibility for it. Gee, I couldn't do anything. I was sick.
Yeah,
It's a
and
terrible
he
character.
really personified the the narrow specialist, the scientist that wants to just do what he's doing and doesn't think of the consequences, the unintended consequences that can happen from what he's doing. And in a way, that kind of captured the whole, I think, the whole of modern life in a way, to us, considering what we're doing to our environment by the way we live. See it on it. All right, back to America here with David Thoreau. 1854 now. Men have become the tools of their tools. Ponder that. But I love this. What is the use of a fine house if you haven't got a tolerable planet to put it on? How many stop to think of that? Okay. 3 years later, John Stuart Mill, one of the classical economists, actually, was thinking in terms of a no-growth economy. Not a failed economy, but an economy that didn't just build itself around continuous growth, as ours has done. Continuous growth in a finite system is impossible. Sooner or later, you come up to limits. You cannot have continuous growth. As others have said, continuous growth is the motto or creed of the cancer cell. And this idea of a stationary state, a no-growth economy, an economy that on purpose decides not to grow, is an incredibly radical idea. Modern economists find it just absolutely anathema. They won't touch the idea. And the one economist who has touched it has been ostracized to a large degree from the discipline for doing so. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is what John Stuart Mill said in 1857. A stationary condition of capital and population implies no stationary state of human improvement. There would be as much scope as ever for all kinds of mental culture and moral and social progress, as much room for improving the art of living, and much more likelihood of its being improved if you didn't have to be constantly on the treadmill of making things grow, grow, grow. Again, very, very radical idea that it hasn't sunk in at all 150 years, 200 years later. But we'll someday have to come to realize that. You cannot have continuous growth in a finite system. Just 3 years after that, John Ruskin, who was a historian of art at Oxford, said, the real science of political economy, which has yet to be distinguished from the bastard science, as medicine from witchcraft, or astronomy from astrology, is that which teaches nations to desire and labor for the things that lead to life, and to scorn and destroy the things that lead to destruction. My colleagues in political science and economics would be very surprised to learn that that's the real science of political economy. That's not what they think it is at all. The social sciences have not helped us nearly as much as their potential would imply. They have a lot of potential to help, but they get wrapped up in their own little problems the way science often does, and neglect the larger issues of society, and don't really inform the rest of us about those things, and talking their own jargon and talking to each other too much. So, Matthew Arnold in 1885 says it could not be more contemporary. We are wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born. What do you think of that? Does that describe in any way the feeling that you have, you know, the frustration that you might feel, in the sense that we know things are not working for us the way they used to, and yet we can't seem to find the way to change them to make them work for us again?
To try to extricate oneself from the system as it exists right now, one has to almost totally withdraw. And
that's
I
not
don't
easy.
think anybody really wants to do that.
That's not easy, that's right.
Right, to really pull oneself out of the system and be able to survive, it's very difficult to
It
do.
is indeed.
And I don't know if that's pointing to sort of what you're talking about. We want the two worlds. We see what we're caught in, but then to pull oneself out of it is well nigh impossible.
It is very difficult. And there's a novel that was written back in the 70s called Ecotopia. Did anybody ever read that? Ecotopia? It's about us here in the Pacific Northwest. And the idea in the novel was that the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, maybe a little Montana, withdraw from the United States, secede from the United States, to set up their own government and society based on ecological principles. And the novel, they've been doing this for 10 or 20 years when they finally admit a reporter from the United States to come in and look over the society and see what it's like and report back on that. And it's really fascinating. I commend it to you. It's not a great novel, but it's a very interesting read, and it has the kind of ideas in it that in many ways we have begun to implement, the kinds of recycling and that sort of thing. But it's kind of a vision of that world that is powerless to be born, and as such, it's worth thinking about.
Is this kind of what's happening with this Occupy the Cities thing, that they know something's wrong, and so they're withdrawing,
Right.
but they haven't been able to pull it together to see the direction to go?
It really seems to be. It really does. They're being criticized for that very heavily, for not focusing more, but they're reacting against so many things. How can you focus when there's so much wrong? And each group or each person has their own direct knowledge or concern about what's wrong, and so that's what they're going to focus on. Or it's very hard to pull all this together into any single kind of thing, you know, when so much is wrong. So I think it's very understandable that they're not more focused than they are. I think it's very promising that they're out there showing that they're sick of it right now, and to change.
And backing up a little bit, one of the main features of Ecotopia after they succeed is that they no longer wish to be oil dependent.
No longer wish to be what?
Oil dependent.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So cars are banned, transportation is done in a totally different way.
Right. Burgundy, Virginia.
Yeah, I'm thinking that why we're powerless. And I think there are many people, there are actually quite a fair number of organizations and people out there who are moving towards what we right-thinking Haitians would want. But I think the problem is that they haven't yet recognized that if they all got together, and because the more groups, the more people you have that are joined together, the more power they have. And it's not just the sum of them. It creates its own dynamic, and maybe that's what somebody needs to do, is to start thinking, if you belong to one of these organizations, start thinking of how you can deal with other organizations and create that dynamic power that will actually let us change, not withdraw from, but change where we are.
Good point.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you're not with us, you're with us.
Well, okay.
Right? I mean, if you're not with us, you're against us.
Are you trying to point something out?
It was said by our leader,
I think a lot of people give up their power. And what they do is that they allow others to usurp it. And then when they start feeling like the whole world is crushing down on them, become angry and upset and frustrated with what's going on. But in reality, they didn't vote, they didn't participate in local government, they didn't do some of the other things that are basic pieces that help to regulate some of the overpowering things that are happening.
Yeah, well, apathy and distraction are
huge.
two of the major problems of our political system, all right?
And the other thing is that I've got my hog and I don't want somebody else to have it. And you don't take it away from me either. And so, so I think that that's another thing that goes into that whole feeling that's occurring.
Sure.
And the other thing, let's not kid ourselves, is that we have a system basically of legalized bribery. And if you don't have big bucks, you don't matter.
All too
And that's the hard thing we have to face. And frankly, I don't know what the answer is to that.
Just
Well,
not
I
true
think
in
that's-
YAAS, then.
No, it's not true.
I think that's a large reason behind the protests that are going on around the country right now, is that money in politics is the underlying issue. And that may unite the whole movement eventually. I hope that there is a group called Move to Amend, which is trying to set up a constitutional amendment to reverse that Supreme Court decision from last year allowing corporations to contribute unlimited amounts of money to campaigns. And that's the kind of thing that you maybe come out of this.
Yeah, I think another factor here is that we've become such a competition-oriented society. I mean, it's getting worse and worse. We even make competition out of dancing and things of that sort. And I think that we need to somehow or other shift into cooperation rather than competition. In fact, one of your earlier slides pointed out the importance of cooperation.
That's right.
But I'm not sure how you turn a society back to seeing the importance of cooperation rather than competition. One thing, you could get rid of professional sports.
And high price of college sports too.
Well, you know, as times get tougher, and they will, inevitably, I think we'll see the need for cooperation more and more, so that there's somewhat of a silver lining to the very dark cloud that most of us see ahead. So, see about that? Yes.
Greed and the lust for power are not new to the human species. It has happened all throughout history that people with power want more power. It is not new. Perhaps there is a basic flaw in humanity that makes it impossible for us to stop pursuing those goals of power and greed. What do you think?
I think there is a basic instinct in humanity for self-preservation. You know, I think that without a doubt, and that can lead to self-interest in predominating. But I don't think we should think of it as a deterministic sort of thing, that it's going to always be that way. And in fact, that's what democracy is designed to deal with, you know, to try to ameliorate those tendencies in the human animal. And if the democracy works properly, it can do that. But it's not working properly at the moment, and we see the result of that. It just brings out those tendencies even more. But, yeah, Tom.
Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolution sort of asks the question, why, when we have a new paradigm, a new worldview, what prevents it, even though there's so much evidence to support it, what prevents it from coming into the fore instead of, and it's all these reasons that people have already mentioned. It said his claim, when he looks at the history of paradigm shifts, is that they only happen after people who are committed to the old paradigm eventually get old and die.
Yeah. although as the anomalies build up, as the old paradigm explains less and less, and things are not adding up, the pressure on it increases and increases until, that's when the shift can occur, even without that generation dying off. But that's, hopefully, at least, yeah.
Kind of to follow up on Tom's question and to bypass the question of who has power and who should have it. I'm interested in a little more information on the economist that you mentioned, the one who did adopt the idea of a no-growth economy and that it can work. How does he see the transition to that economy happening? Because I bet that's where he has a problem with the other economists.
Yeah, he certainly did. Let me get to that more toward the end when I have some quotes from him, but that's a very, very good question. Yeah. Okay, let's move along. Here's another economist, a British economist from 1920, who said something that's very pertinent to us today. He says, "These are times which are not ordinary. And in such times it is not enough to follow the roads. It is necessary to know where it leads. And if it leads nowhere, to follow another. The search for another involves reflection, which is uncongenial to the bustling people who describe themselves as practical. But the practical thing for a traveler who is uncertain of his path is not to proceed with the utmost rapidity in the wrong direction. It is to consider how to find the right one." And perhaps that is a big part of the demonstrations that are occurring right now too. People are talking together in those situations when they're out there in the plazas and the squares and the streets. They're talking together, trying to decide what the real problems are and what workable solutions might be. That's a very, very positive thing, it seems to me. And it may look like it's unfocused, but it's a necessary part of the process of trying to decide what is really wrong and where do we work first to try to change things. Anyone?
That's why you're here.
I wish that I could have the answers, yeah.
A lot of that appearing to be unfocused probably is focused, but it's not being covered very well by the media. And they've been pointing out different trails, but not the correct ones.
You think it's more focused than they're telling us?
I think so. I think there are probably lots of groups like this, and it's great to be here tonight.
Well, I think they share the focus of a great concern about money and politics in this system. I think everybody is beginning to recognize that that is a very fundamental part of the problem. That as long as corporations are allowed to be persons and are allowed to have the Bill of Rights protecting them as persons, and therefore have free speech, and that money is speech, those kinds of distortions of fact are what have created the situation to a large extent. Yeah.
But that's gone through history way back when kings existed. I mean, it's the same story.
Well, it wasn't the same story always in this country. I mean, we have had times when democracy prevailed over money, or not too many perhaps, but we've been working toward that, and we've just backslided a lot in recent years, I think. But again, that's the theory of democracy, is that the people, the numbers, can outweigh the individuals with the greater power or money. And if the people allow themselves to be distracted and not pay attention and not be involved, that's fatal to a democracy. And that is largely what has happened.
But it seems almost like, me, the little person in YAAS. What do you do when they have money? Money talks.
Yeah, it does. And that's why I think the utter frustration that leads to people finally getting in the streets results from that kind of a feeling of powerlessness. And just being in the streets is not enough. You've got to shut things down. And when there are enough people in the streets to shut things down, and more people out there than can be arrested, then maybe we'll start seeing some responses to this, some positive responses.
Sounds like 1968.
Yeah. Yeah, 1968 was a good example of people really in the streets of it.
The real alternative, of course, is dropping out of the system. I'm so fearful that this next election is going to see so many people so disenchanted and so unaware of options that they simply say, I'm sitting at home.
That's true. That's true. But then it also leaves a situation in which a minority can really make a difference, perhaps, because the others aren't paying attention. So there's a good side and a bad side to that. H.G. Wells, one of the most futuristic fellows of all. History is a race between education and catastrophe. He really nailed it there. And education, of course, is what we're doing right now. We're educating each other and in discussion. And you don't have to have education just in school. Remember Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, the author of The Yearling? She had an orange grove down in Florida. That's where she wrote The Yearling. And she made this wonderful comment in 42. But what of the land? It seems to me that the earth may be borrowed, but not bought. It may be used, but not owned. It gives itself in response to love and tending, and offers its seasonal flowering and fruiting. But we are tenants and not possessors, lovers and not masters. Take someone with a real literary flair to put it that beautifully, I think. But that attitude toward the land is something that has been totally lacking in our Western tradition.
It seems to me that it's a beautiful rendition of prose that reflects the basic teachings of Native Americans.
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Excuse me? Can't hear you?
I can't quite hear you.
That it's a beautiful rendition in prose that reflects the sentiments of many people who have lived for centuries in this country, Native Americans, Aboriginals, primitive so-called people throughout time have said the very same things over and over again.
That's true. In fact, I have a quote from a Nigerian tribesman that's almost, it's in different words saying exactly the same thing. You're right. But I don't have it in the series. Yeah?
It reminds me of the Native American quote that the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth.
That's right. That's right. And again, how do we reincorporate wisdom like that into our consciousness when we have been moving in the opposite direction for so long? That's what we're up against. And we can't expect it to be a very rapid change. We've been going in that wrong direction for a long time, and we can't be discouraged if it's going to take a while, to get that kind of thing changed around. I see another. Yeah, Greg.
Isn't this at some level at the heart of the environmental movement? I mean, as environmentalists, this would seem to me to express a lot of what we believe.
Absolutely. Certainly.
It's about sustainability at one level.
Right. And one of the grandfathers of the environment movement is Aldo Leopold. And I'll quote him in a minute, and saying almost the same thing. Go ahead. But again, the poet. Pity this busy monster, man, unkind. Not. Progress is a comfortable disease. A world of made is not a world born. Pity poor flesh and trees. Again, the poet has the insight that we ignore at our peril. They sometimes can see things so much more clearly than the rest of us. And certainly that is that manages to do it. Progress is a comfortable disease. Progress, the motto of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment, the 18th century movement that we have carried forward in our civilization. We are the Enlightenment civilization. Worships progress. And yet progress is a comfortable disease. A world made is not a world born. Pity poor flesh and trees. Again, H.G. Wells, a couple of years before he died, before the atomic bomb was even dropped, if we don't end war, war will end us. And that is a piece of wisdom that has been around for a lot longer than his saying, that we have not paid much attention to either.
But has there ever been a time in history when there wasn't war?
Not really.
So,
But don't say so like that.
Probably help a little bit with that.
There's never been a time in history when war could destroy the life support system of the planet either. And so, you know, we have more motivation than we've ever had in all history to outlaw war and enforce that. So find some way of enforcing that. And that's, again, that's something that's been kind of shunted aside. It's not on the screen right now. We don't hear much about the idea of abolishing war. Why? Because we're the big gun in the world, you know, and we use war as an instrument of our foreign policy, just like that.
We use it as an instrument of our economy.
And of
There's no better way to make money than to wage war.
For some people, you know, for some groups. But again, that's where education is the race between, or the race between catastrophe. We've got to come to more understanding of how profitable war is for some groups, and why they want to keep a huge war machine ready and oiled and ready to go all the time. And like the kid that you give the hammer, you know, everything looks like a nail to that kid. And as long as we have that kind of a big war machine all ready to go, we'll use it. And we can't do that if we want a world without war.
To revisit your initial question, why don't you learn? Stop and think about this particular issue and get back to kind of a root cause, unbridled population increase. I mean, it seems to me inevitable that the planet continues to produce people, as it appears to be on our way to doing, with finite resources available. Human conflict on a global scale is unavoidable. It's inevitable. I think we are looking at our future and simply in denial.
Well, the developed countries of the world aren't growing any longer. We're down to, you know, in many cases, negative population growth. We're actually decreasing in many countries in Europe. And we would not have any real population growth to speak of in this country if it weren't for immigration. So people can learn to limit the number of children in their family, and can therefore reduce population growth. And in fact, that is happening to such an extent in the developed world that as development occurs elsewhere, you know, it's expected that it'll happen there as well, and it is showing some signs of it, just as women get more opportunities in life than to be a mother and able to get some education and so forth. Population rates are dropping all around the world.
But not globally.
Well, yes, globally even. There's still continued growth, but the fertility rates are dropping all around the world. And you know, very few countries in Africa maybe might not follow that pattern, but almost all the countries in the world are showing rising population.
But I'm seeing population numbers that suggest that we're going to see a 50% increase in the population of the planet by the year 2050.
No, the median population projection of the United Nations for 2050 is about 9 billion. We're 7 billion now.
We're about 6 right now.
No, we'll be 7 this month or next month. It's 7 billion. And 9 billion is the projection. But they're actually slow. You know, what I just gave a graph the other day in class that I had to correct because it had the number of years it takes to add the next billion to the human population. And it is stretching out a little bit now. It was 11 years, and now it's 13. So that's some. But the point is that population growth is a result of individual decisions, the circumstances that those individuals are living. And if those circumstances can be improved, education and occupational positions for women and so forth, if that can happen, then it will produce a lower population growth. It's done that everywhere. But the question is, can it do it in time?
We're also living longer.
Excuse me?
We're also living longer.
Yes,
I mean, even if the birth rate goes down, we're living longer.
Yeah. Well, that won't make it an increase in population. That's just, once it's already there, it's there. It's not an increase. Yeah.
Maybe the focus is on the wrong issue to a certain extent. If the population growth was enabled by technology in food production, and if technology has made war into such a drastic thing that it could destroy the planet, maybe the focus should be on stopping or undoing technology.
Well, certainly technology has to be controlled, yeah.
It's easy to say there are too many people and war is bad.
The cat's out of the bag.
Cat's out of the bag. I've seen a documentary that talks about the productive capacity of the oceans, which sort of provides a considerable amount of food for a lot of this planet. And the numbers are pretty sobering. Major fish populations are in decline big time. We're out there basically scooping up everything that moves.
With technology.
Yeah.
That's right.
That technology is out there, you can't unring that bell.
And that's back to Frankenstein. The monster is turning on us. Can we control it or not? And how can we control it? Again, democracy is the best remedy that's ever been created for controlling all these things. The question is, can we make democracy work?
How many people in this room would vote to undo technology right now?
It depends on which
Mike,
technology.
repeat that,
please. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, way over here.
Yeah, there are 3 things you focused on tonight. Economic growth, which is dominion over the earth, population growth, and now war. And the number 1 reason for war nowadays is faith. So far, I haven't heard you say anything about religion, which I think is the root cause of many of these issues you've discussed.
It plays its role, but I would hesitate to make it the root cause. I think there are other causes that religion can compound.
A root cause, not the root cause.
Yeah, a cause. Well, it certainly is a cause. Let's move on. So Wells, again, in 1945, this was the year he died, I believe. Adapt or perish, now as ever, is nature's inexorable imperative. Darwin pretty well told us that in 1860, and repeatedly it has been told to us afterwards. And conditions have obviously changed in many ways, and how are we adapting to those conditions? The rise of the great corporation, for instance, has changed everything in our country in terms of our democracy. We have not adapted to that rise of corporations to make our, to be able to say it's not a legal person, things like that. So that's the challenge. One of the greatest historians of all time who focused on civilizations. Well, I think it was 27 civilizations altogether that he dealt with in terms of having risen and fallen over time. Pointed to war and class are the two congenital diseases of civilization. Class has now become capable of irrevocably disintegrating society, and war of annihilating the entire human race. We have to abolish war and class under pain of seeing them win a victory over man, which this time would be conclusive and definitive. You have to get to these guys. They really spell it out for us. They're not pulling any punches. But are we listening? And if we listen, do we just feel powerless, or do we try to do something to adapt to the situation? That's what we're really about tonight, is to ask ourselves that question. Okay. Now, good old Aldo Leopold, the man who came up with the land ethic, very much along the lines of the Marjorie Kinnan Rollins quote. He looked at the land as a biotic community, a whole living community. And he says all ethics rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of an interdependent part, is a member of a community of interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, water, plants, or collectively speaking, the land. This is a perspective that, again, has not caught on yet, but that inevitably must prevail. We have to understand our intimate interdependence, not just among human beings, but with the underlying biotic community that supports us. And once we do make that flip of consciousness and understand that, our solutions, I think, will be a lot more apparent, and we won't be so frustrated at the idea that there just aren't any solutions to these problems. Certain major changes like that can happen when kind of a critical mass of people understanding it, talking about it, thinking about it, come together, and boom, all of a sudden people see this new perspective. It's a paradigm shift, as Thomas put it. And that kind of a paradigm shift is what we're about. We're trying to promote that while there's still time. Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian, I thought was very prescient in saying, television may represent a threat to our culture analogous to the threat of atomic weapons to our civilization. So the threat to our culture versus the threat to our civilization. And in 1952, I was going down to the neighbor's house and looking at the snow falling on their screen. You know, back in those days, only one or two people in the neighborhood had a TV. And he saw that already. So we have people like the poets I've been quoting and scholars like that who have the vision that we need. It's there. We just need to be more aware of it. And that's where the education comes in.
So in this particular instance, the choices would appear to be very clear. If you believe this, turn it off.
Or don't have it.
Indeed, throw it out. Right.
But is it a threat, or is it just means of furthering our culture as it evolves in response to television? I don't see it so much as a threat, as a tool that we can use one way or another.
Or that uses us.
We
One way
have
or
a
the other.
choice. We have not just on the viewing end, but on the putting cut out their end of things, and now that includes the internet, not just television.
Yeah, it does.
So it's a tremendous opportunity to make changes to the culture in a mass fashion, which you couldn't do with it because we didn't have one here. But we have the opportunity. There's a tool. Are we going to use it, or are we just going to let the money people work to the lowest common denominator and thereby change our culture?
Right. It goes back to how it's used and who has the power to use it.
There's a big difference between television, sort of the analog world, although it's digital today, and the internet, which is essentially the communication vehicle of the masses. The resources required to put something out over the airwaves, as it were, are pretty high. And that allows only those people who have concentrated amounts of wealth to be able to do that, so they control the message. I guess my issue with TV has really to do with the quality of the content. Is there anything worth listening to? By virtue of its nature, it encourages the people who run this country, both the political world and the commercial world, into this soundbite world. So they distill everything down to its simplest form, and we just eat it up like it was true. I for one believe
is that it creates an inferior culture. The resulting dialectic is the decadence of an entire society. Now that is a little wordy and complicated, but read it over and think about it and visualize this decadence, this dynamic that is going on as the elite corrupts the mass, as Greg was just saying, with the kind of worthless programs and advertising that saturate television. And the mass, in turn, corrupt the elite, because what are their children watching? They're watching the same programs, and they are being corrupted in the process of their growing up because the culture itself is being corrupted. And that is the decadence of an entire society spiraling down. Yeah.
P.T. Barnum said, "No one has ever lost money by underestimating the taste of the American public."
We're awful hard on ourselves, you know. We're also the American public, and we're out here on a Saturday night when we could be doing an awful lot of other things, and we're pondering these ideas that are not exactly uplifting in many ways, you know. And there are groups like us in every city in the country. People are trying to find the answers, and they're not yet totally lost. Don't give up on us, I think is my bottom line. Another of the fathers of the environmental movement, E.F. Schumacher, the author of Small is Beautiful, often called the Bible of the environmental movement. An attitude to life which seeks fulfillment in the single-minded pursuit of wealth, in short, materialism, does not fit into this world because it contains within itself no limiting principle, while the environment in which it is placed is strictly limited. So we have some fundamental problems in our whole outlook in modern Western society, and particularly in the discipline of economics, which does not recognize any limits and is completely tied into continuous economic growth. And here's the economist who has bucked his whole discipline and has in fact been penalized through his whole career, but managed to have a very brilliant career nonetheless, and a lot of worldwide recognition in all circles except that of economists. Herman Daly. He is the foremost theorist of the steady state economy. He happens to be a dear friend of mine. We went to graduate school together, and he lost his arm to polio. And once, when I had him come to OSU to give a lecture, I introduced him as the world's leading theorist of the steady state economy. And in his characteristic fashion, he stood up and he said, I want to thank Dick for that wonderful introduction. He says, but I, in all truth, have to tell you, I am also the world's only one-armed economist named Herman. He said, the problem is there's not much competition for the position. He came up with that just like that. And there is indeed no competition whatsoever for the theorists of the steady state economy among economists. They just won't address the issue. It's phenomenal. They call themselves a science, and yet someone who's credentialed in their science, who's moved up to full professor at Louisiana State University and with visiting appointments at Yale, and later was a senior economist for the World Bank for 6 years. In fact, Science Magazine, the organ of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the main scientific journal of the country, editorialized when the World Bank hired him and said maybe the World Bank will now begin to take the environment seriously. It has hired Herman Daly as a senior economist in the environmental division. That's rare recognition right there, but not from economists. But here's the issue about growth. This is what makes growth so hard to deal with. The important issue of the stationary state, the no growth state, will be distribution, not production. The problem of relative shares can no longer be avoided by appeals to growth. In other words, how often have you heard, don't worry. If you're getting a smaller share than some of the big cats, fat cats in the society, is your share bigger this year than it was last year? Well, yeah, it has grown a little bit. Okay, so things are getting better. But you don't look at the fact that the fat cat's share has grown a whole lot more than the relative shares of the thing. So the problem of relative shares can no longer be avoided by appeals to growth. The argument that everyone should be happy as long as his absolute share of wealth increases, regardless of his relative share, will no longer be available. The stationary state would make fewer demands on our environmental resources, but much greater demands on our moral resources. And that might explain a lot about why we haven't been interested in looking seriously at the steady state economy, the moral resources that it requires. Donella Meadows was the principal author of a book in 1971 called The Limits to Growth, which is one of the first uses of computers to chart the direction that things were going and what would happen when it hit limits. And this is what she said, I think we have to take this extremely seriously. The concept of society in a steady state of economic and ecological equilibrium may appear easy to grasp, although the reality is so distant from our experience as to require a Copernican revolution of the mind. Only the conviction that there is no other avenue to survival can liberate the moral, intellectual, and creative forces to initiate this unprecedented human undertaking. That is a very sobering assessment, but it's probably true. And the good news is we're coming onto a period where we're going to have to do that. I think with all the printing of these trillions of dollars that's been going on from our Federal Reserve, we are up against the prospect of a hyperinflation that we just can't imagine at this point, that will wipe us all out. All our savings will be worthless. It'll be like in Germany in 1923, 24, 25, when they had wheelbarrows full of Deutschmarks to go to the bakery to get one loaf of bread.
At lunch before the inflation went on until dinner time.
The what, John?
I said, at lunch, they had to go out at lunch because by dinner time,
That's right. And it had by dinner time, it would be more wheelbarrows. I mean, the prospect ahead is just, it's truly frightening. And yet, in that desperate situation, we have the choice of finally coming together and thinking about these things more seriously, and taking them more seriously, and changing some very fundamental aspects of our political philosophies, our social philosophies, our value systems, as we see the necessity for that. So, a sense of mourning about a disastrous past and a sense of terror vis-a-vis the future are the starting point for hope. So I hope in the sense that we have dealt with some pretty sobering things, some pretty sad and frightening things, and the prospect is terrifying. I think we can see that there, in that situation, there is still hope. And that's what I want to leave with you, is the hope. So thank you so much for the conversation that has made this lively and interesting for all of us.
Yeah, could you get back to my question from earlier? The one-armed economist. What is the path that he sees to transition to a no-growth economy that is so hard for other economists to grasp?
Yeah. Well, he starts with on the resource side with depletion quotas, for instance. The government would establish how much of a resource could be used in the year to come and in succeeding years, and would sell or would auction, in effect, quotas for that resource up to that limit. Companies would bid for those and buy them. The ones that got the depletion quotas could then proceed to deplete the resource that much that year. There's pretty technical things involved in all this, but that's on the depletion side, on the resource side. I hesitate to even mention the one on the population side.
No, please do.
It's so outrageous sounding, but and it takes a while to really get into it and understand it. And so by mentioning it, I probably won't do it any justice at all. But the idea was that every woman would be issued a DESI child certificate with every birth. The limit would be for 2 births. So each woman would have 1.1 DESI child certificates for each child, and with 2 it would be 2.2, and that's replacement level fertility. Now, what is a DESI child certificate? It's like a stock certificate or anything else. It's in 10 parts, and there's a market created for them. So everybody has 1/10 extra that they don't need. That would be something they would sell on the market immediately. If they didn't want to have any children, they would sell all 11 DESI child certificates. DESI is 10, right? 10 strong.
Yeah.
So the market would decide then which people could have larger families. That, under circumstances of utter inequality, that would be terrible. But of course, he's saying you have to work toward this in the process of focusing on the distribution problem in society and get the levels of income and wealth more compressed than they are now. And in that situation, then it wouldn't be so unfair. And people who wanted to have big families could sacrifice somewhat in other spending to accumulate the certificates necessary to have another child. But everyone would have to have, 10 DESI children certificates in order to have the right to have a child. And that's, as I say, pretty far-fetched and pretty repugnant.
Hard to regulate.
very hard to regulate that number, and not something that can be implemented anytime soon. It would take quite a while to get that distribution problem of the society down to not have a super rich class, you know, and a very rich bunch and a very poor bunch. Otherwise, it would be so unfair that it wouldn't, you know, even on its face would not work. But these things, you know, he has worked these out, and they are there to be studied. And that's what's important, is that when the crunch comes, that we have the ideas worked out already, that we can then explain and explore and come to understand whether we want to apply them or not. And they do make a lot of sense, actually, when you finally do understand it thoroughly.
These auctions for natural resources, did he envision those on a global scale or on a national scale, where one rich country said
That's
we're going to auction
a
off
very
everybody's
good question.
resources?
And he recognizes it has to be done on a national basis, because we don't have the legal system on a global basis to enforce these things. On a national system, we do. And so we would have to start doing that ourselves, you know, and be an example to the rest of the world of how it works.
Except a lot of our resources come from abroad.
Global economy.
And you would auction those off too?
Yeah, well, these are other problems too.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, Jerome.
Can we go back to this gentleman's comment about religion? Because from a number of these quotes, it's pretty clear to me that religion could be both a tremendous force in moving things in the right direction, and what it seems to me now, a tremendous force in moving things in the wrong direction. So what could be done with religion that would have religions actually do what they say they're supposed to be doing?
I think it's up on the slide right there.
Oh, good luck.
Oh, yes.
Anyone have a good answer for that one?
White elephant, nobody wants to talk about.
It has to be a generational thing. You just have to teach children well.
This may be very much what Tom was saying, yeah.
Seems like a Buddhist perspective might be relevant here, where you know, a oneness of all things, whether animal, mineral, vegetable. I know an example in Thailand where the monks have ordained trees in a forest to personify them, so that the people had a spiritual regard far higher than they might for a tree, given that it's now personified, to try to maintain forest culture. So it seems to me like there is some example out there of religions that have taken a stance.
From an evolutionary perspective, we're pretty much, we still have the brains that our Cro-Magnon ancestors did when they lived politically.
That's right.
They had foresight also, but their foresight was, you know, maybe storing up enough food to get through those, you know, that lean winter. And that was, well, they evolved that kind of thinking for millions of years. And now we're being asked, everyone in this room is being asked to think further beyond our lifetime and act now to prevent what looks like is going to occur in the future. And I guess the question I'm asking is, are we really capable of really thinking that far ahead, way beyond our own lifetime? And it's a legitimate question, and I'm wondering if you would comment on that. Do you really think that we have that capability to really act now? And none of us in here are really going to see the results of it.
Well, anyone who's ever planted a tree has had that faith, because you know somebody else will get to sit in the shade of it. And as Don said, this bridge that we just dedicated today is going to be there a lot longer than any of us will be here to cross it. I think we do have the capacity to think ahead and to plan ahead and think about our children and our grandchildren. We may not have that, I think it's a Native American belief, you know, to look at the seventh generation, and how the seventh generation ahead will be affected by what action you do now. But certainly we can think of our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. That's not too far ahead. There are many of us alive already. And that, you know, that shows we have that capacity. We can extend it more and more with education and with moral instruction, and you know, that borders on religion. Maybe it's a religious perspective that would bring us to that, if it were the kind of religion that embodied the oneness of all life. And you know, religions have arisen and spread like wildfire many times in the past, and it's not inconceivable that could occur again. Sort of an ecologically based religion could appear with its own prophet, perhaps, and spread. Yes?
I actually think a lot of the indigenous cultures have that very much as part of their way of being.
They do.
Is that the generations accept the fact that what they do affects every generation after that. And learning from the indigenous cultures, I think, is really important for where we're at right now. There's an organization called the Pachamama Alliance that is a partnership between Western cultures and the Ashwa Indians in the Brazilian rainforest, I believe. I think it's Brazilian.
Pachamama is a Quechua term for in the Inca language in the Peruvian Andes.
And these two groups of people came together in partnership to save the planet. That's their goal. And it came about because the indigenous culture that had never participated with Western civilizations at all approached, I know this is going to sound a little way out there, but approached the Western culture in a dream state and said that we have to come together. And this organization is doing really well. They're actually doing a lot of things using both the indigenous religion and the Western way of being, partnering on this. So I really believe that there are organizations that are making this happen.
I'm really glad you said you knew about that and tell us about it, because I think it's all too easy for us to despair about the kinds of possibilities that we've been discussing tonight. And goodness knows they will be difficult. But there are tens of thousands of groups all around the world that are organized in different components of this problem, organized around different components of this great problem that we're talking about, the whole problematique, as it's called. And there will be a point at which I think a critical mass will be reached, and then the change can be so rapid at that point. But it does take, I think, a sense of mourning about how badly we have screwed up to this point. How terribly we have squandered the wealth that has been given us on this planet. And with that real sense of mourning about that, and then realizing how terrible things can become very quickly in the future, then these groups, cross-fertilization and understandings can be widened and disseminated so much faster than we would believe, and partly because we are so interconnected now with technology. We have this fantastic instrument, the internet, that enables us to communicate so fast all around the world, all at once. Yeah.
My name is Ruth, some of you know me, and I've recently moved here, and I'd like to share a very positive story about sharing wealth with this community. I decided that when I found an apartment, of course I came with I think a couple of backpacks and that was it. I have my own apartment. It is totally furnished, and I call them love gifts of stuff that people in YAAS closet for years. The entire place I'm living is a love gift, and I need nothing. I mean, this is a true story in talking about, especially at the beginning of your talk. If we share our wealth, just the things we don't need.
That's right.
Not necessarily
Great place to
want,
start.
but don't need. So this community is doing a lot of what you're talking about, and also the minds of people tonight. It's a pleasure to listen to people's thinking, because it's a caring, but it's also a sharing, compassionate community. And I am an example of this love that has been shown to me through stuff.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That is a very inspiring message that we all need to hear. Well, again, thank you so much for your close attention and for your participation in this discussion. Go forth and talk about it with your friends.